I'm Peter Curti, a research fellow here in the Religion and Civil Society program, a program that looks at the impact that religion has on a free society in different ways and the kind of contribution that religion makes. CIS is a secular organization. We take a strictly, as it were, secular approach to religion. There's no confessional business or interdenominational or intra-denominational wrangling that happens here. It's very much religion as a phenomenon of civil society. And as part of that program, I'm really delighted to welcome our special guest tonight, Professor Bob Woodberry, who's come to speak on religion, democracy, and economic development. Before I introduce Professor Woodberry, let me just say how the evening will run. It's now just a little after 6:05. Bob will speak for 30 or 40 minutes. We'll have a Q&A session after that, and then I'll call upon Professor Paul Oslington to give the vote of thanks. So we'll wind up no later than 7:30. And if I could just ask you to take a moment to check that your mobile phone is off or at least switch to vibrate mode, I'd be grateful. We are recording the session, and during the Q&A, a microphone will roam around. So if you don't want to be if you don't want your presence to be recorded here tonight, just say nothing and keep your head down, and all will be well. All will be well. Professor Bob Woodberry is director of the Project on Religion and Economic Change and also an associate professor of political science at the National University of Singapore. For 2015, he is a visiting fellow in the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame in the US. His research analyzes the long-term roots of education, mass printing, economic development, and democracy in former colonies. Other interests include religious influences on political institutions and the economy, and the international diffusion of social movements and printing. He is supported by a large grant from the Templeton Foundation, and with that grant he built a global geospatial database of virtually all Protestant and Catholic missionary activity, education and medical work from the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries, and he connected detailed measures of colonial history, climate, terrain, and geography. Prodigiously well-informed, well-travelled, and well-researched, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome to CIS now, Professor Bob Woodberry. Bob.
The World Bank and the IMF and the United Nations and the US government and the Australian government have put in a lot of work to try and promote economic development around the world, to promote democracy around the world, sometimes with rather mixed results. But there's a lot of interest then in terms of why do some countries end up developing over the long term? And why do some countries end up becoming more democratic over the long term? Because a lot of short-term policies that have been done to try and change that haven't worked that effectively. So there's debates about economic institutions or education, what's called human capital, in terms of trying to explain, and people argue about what are these crucial factors that lead to long-term development. Well, one of the things I ask of that is, well, where did the institutions come from, and where did the education come from? And so I look at the role of religion and religious groups and how they have shaped society in terms of how that has shaped long-term economic and political change. Now, whenever you're talking about long-term economic and political change, there's issues of measurement and there's issues of definition. But it's also very difficult to tease out different explanations. So, for example, a lot of you get the rise of this rapid scale economic development in Europe and the rise of modern representative democracy in Europe. And there's a lot of arguments about how that happened. And they're difficult to then differentiate what are the crucial factors in Europe as well as elsewhere. And so what I do is I make arguments in Europe, and then I look at the role of missionaries, Protestant and Catholic missionaries, as well as European settlers and colonizers, various different groups who've gone around the world, and look at how they have then shaped things which shape long-term development and long-term democratization, political liberty. And then I make comparative historical arguments, and then I try and measure them statistically. And the way I organize the data is so that I can look at both between countries but also regions of countries. I won't focus too much on the statistics, but we'll talk about them some because they're important. So what I've done is I'm looking at the role of missionaries as well as other colonial and settlers and actors. And so I located the longitude and latitude of virtually every Protestant mission station from the 1820s through the 1920s. And then I have data on the Catholic Church and their activity, but it's not normally at the point level. It's like the equivalent of a diocese. They have different names. But then I reconstructed the history of them through time, back to 1500. So I know the borders of them based on papal decrees. And then I have data which then is associated with those places. And then I link that data to modern data. So this is in Spanish, obviously. But it's looking at Mexico, and this is a Catholic ecclesiastical jurisdiction, which is the big unit, and then there's municipalities that are smaller units, and then churches and urban areas and populated places, so that I'm linking up the Catholic data with a census, okay? So that we can look at change through time in terms of development based on many factors, but in terms of what Protestants and Catholic missionaries did. Now, part of the problem is missionaries were not randomly sprinkled around the world. Okay? And so let's say I find an association between where missionaries were and health. Well, did they cause that health? Or did the health move the missionaries? So think of this in two ways. One, I'm a missionary, I'm going out there with my family. Say I'm Protestant, so I'm married, I have kids. And I want my kids to survive. So I go I could go here and my kids could die, or I could go here and my kids could live. So I'm going to go here. And so then I move to a place that's healthy. This is a fictive example. And then there's more missionaries where it's healthier, and I'm looking at this association, and I say, oh, look, missionaries caused health. Well, maybe the health caused where missionaries went. Alternatively, maybe they went equally to places that were healthy and unhealthy, but in the unhealthy places, more of them died. So later on, there's more missionaries in the healthy place, and I go, look, missionaries caused health. They didn't. They survived in places that were healthy. See? So I have to try and tease out the factors that shaped where missionaries went and where they survived to isolate what missionaries contributed to that local context. And there's lots of ways that I go about doing that. One of them is I divide the world into all these very small boxes, like you can see the grid for elevation there. So there's all these little boxes, and I divided up the world. And then I have all these data about climate and soil quality, what the temperature is, how far it is from the coast, how far it is from a navigable river, all kinds of things that shape mortality and access and trade, etc. And then I try and remove that effect from the effect of missions, okay, when I'm measuring these things. That's one way I do it. But I also do historical arguments, and I also do things called natural experiments, which I'll talk about later. This is basically my argument. I argue that, in particular, Protestant missions wanted people to read the Bible in their own language, which now we think, okay, that's easy enough to think. But at the time, most people didn't do that. Most religious traditions didn't think that ordinary people should read the Bible or needed education. So in order to do that, what they did is they pioneered mass education. Education for poor people and education for women. In contexts where religious groups competed with them, in sort of like the equivalent of religious free market, they copied those procedures, and you get an spread through competition of these things that are initiated for a particular religious reason. I'll talk more about it later. But then they also were crucial in terms of the spreading of mass printing and newspapers, nonviolent social movement organizations, and when they were not funded by white settlers or by the state, involved in colonial reform movements. And then I argue that this, in turn, dispersed power to a broader group of people, which then shaped the incentives of those elites by making the elite bigger and having more people who could shape power. And that had political and economic consequences long term. Okay? Now, there's some complexity. Whenever you're talking about religious groups, whenever you're talking about missionaries, we're talking about hundreds of years and the whole world and lots of different types of people. You can find examples of almost anything if you look hard enough. Missionaries did atrocious things, and missionaries did wonderful things. but what's sort of the average effect when we're looking at things like long-term development, okay? And so I wanted to at least make a few caveats so you don't think that I'm just whitewashing the complexity of history and the complexity of real people who are complex like us. One thing is that missionaries who were sponsored by the state, paid for by the state, or paid for by white settlers didn't tend to critique the people who paid them the money. So they're much less critical when governments pay them. Religious groups are much less critical when governments pay their salaries. Okay? Same thing in terms of they become beholden to them. Missionaries also, at least Protestant missionaries, seem to have accentuated ethnic violence in some contexts. So if you think of Asia, for example, I'll just pick Burma. I can pick lots of examples, but they originally went to work with the Burmese. The Burmese were resistant to conversion. The minority people who were sort of dominated and exploited by the Burmese were the ones that converted. So then the missionaries start to work with the Chin and the Karen and the Kachin and these various ethnic minorities who then their language gets written, their education gets in their own indigenous language rather than Burmese, their histories are written down, and it solidifies these ethnic boundaries. They start to move up, becoming wealthier and more educated. The British look around and go like, hey, we'll hire those people. So they hired these minorities into the military and the bureaucracy because they thought they would be more loyal, because they know if the dominant group comes to power, we're going to lose power. So they got hired into the British colonial administration and the military. Then the Burmese resented them, and then they used violence to try and push them down in their place, and then they used violence to try and fight and have independence. And so it creates this cycle of ethnic and religious conflict in places like Burma and Sri Lanka and India and Lebanon, okay? So I'm not saying everything is positive, but there's complex results. Also, I'm not saying that some missionaries were racist. There were plenty of racist missionaries. But there's a spectrum, and they were on the egalitarian fringe of their day because they believed all people were created by God, therefore all people were the same species and were capable of similar abilities. But they were taught in school in the 19th and early 20th century what's called scientific racism. They were told that different races are not equally capable, and they absorbed some of their education and were influenced by it. But they were on the egalitarian fringe, and I can give you lots of evidence for that if you want me to. And there's also change over time. So like, I know the complexity, but we have a short talk, so I use sort of general trends and patterns. Now, missions and education. As I mentioned before, missionaries wanted people to read the Bible in their own language, which meant poor people and women needed to be able to read, which now we think is normal. At the time was a revolutionary thing. Most education at the time was for elites. It was in a foreign language or an archaic version of the language, and people would memorize an adult text, and a tutor would train them in the meaning of the text. So if you think, for example, Chinese, it was in one classical Chinese, which is very different from spoken Chinese. People memorized the sounds of the text, then they were taught the meaning of the words, then they were taught the interpretation of the words, etc., with an adult text. Similarly with classical Arabic, similarly with Latin, various things like that. It's an elite educational system, which is not designed for ordinary people. Religious groups pioneered this idea of mass education, where they have classrooms that are according to graded level. You have texts written for children, texts written in language that's closest to spoken language, etc. Not only are those things pioneered in Europe, but they're spread around the world. And in contexts where you have religious competition, they're also done by Catholic missionaries as well. And they often had the best schools, and they often stayed in it longer than Protestant missionaries who sort of abandoned it over time. But you see a difference in terms of the education that Catholics did in context of religious liberty, the religious competition, and in context where there was a monopoly. They also taught other things. They taught concepts of private property. They spread new skills. They spread new crops. So in Ghana, they introduced cocoa for making chocolate and cotton, various things like that, where they're trying to help indigenous people make money and have a self-supporting church. Now, what is the evidence of that influencing things over time? So this is statistical. You don't need to know all the details of it. What you need to know is you need to notice if it's a positive sign or a negative sign. Okay? So basically what we're doing, this is the thing we're predicting. We're predicting education in 1870. Then later on we're predicting it at later years. So you have these columns, and each one of these is like a regression. Now, these are missionaries before 1870. You know, if missionaries are there before, it has a positive relationship with education in 1870. These are missionaries after that. So if there were no missionaries in a country in 1880, but they got them afterwards, you see the sign is negative. So they went to places that had less education, okay? Not places that had more education. But then if you have missionaries before 1870, so we take this, and now we're talking 1990. So if we have places where there were no missionaries in 1870, we have missionaries in 1890, we see it's a positive relationship with education in 1990. But if you have missionaries who came afterwards, it's a negative coefficient. Now see, so consistently missionaries are going to places on average that have less education before they arrive, and then there's more education after they arrive. So that's evidence that they're causing this difference, not that they didn't just go to places that were already more educated. You see, which that's part of the issue that we have to be concerned about when we're talking about causality. But that's sort of complicated. One way you can look at it is like a natural experiment. So this is a country that was in West Africa. This is along the coast of West Africa. The Germans colonized this place and called it Togoland. In World War I, the French took that half, and the British took this half. And this became part of Gold Coast, which is now Ghana. Okay? Now, the French at this point in time were very anti-clerical. They didn't like missionaries at all, so they tried to keep them out. And if they allowed them, they had to be French. The British didn't want missionaries to work with Muslims. So they tried to keep missionaries out of Muslim areas and also Theravada Buddhist areas, okay? Because there was more of a violent reaction. So they tried to keep people out. So they made a line, you're not allowed to work north of this line in Ghana. So they allowed missionaries in the south, but not in the north, except for a small group of Catholics that they allowed when they got kicked out by the French. They moved up here, okay? So the issue is, we know there's a big difference in education between what's now Ghana and what's now Togo. The question is, did the British cause that, or did missionaries cause that? Okay? If the British caused that, we would expect the difference all along this line. If the missionaries caused it, we would only expect it in the south and not in the north, because the missionaries were not allowed in the north, but the British government was. Okay? And so we look here, these black dots are government schools, and these triangles, diamond shapes are mission schools. Notice this huge concentration of missionaries down here and not up here. And then this is the change of education in the south. So you're looking at, we're getting closer and closer to the border. We hit the border, boink. We move down to here. Okay? We're getting closer and closer to the border, and then boink, we move down to here. Okay, so you notice there's this discontinuity that happens right at the border. We're looking at the same ethnic groups in what used to be the same colony, but one got taken away. Now this is only in the south. In the north, it's a straight line. It's like, boop, no difference across the border. You see, so that's evidence that it was missionaries that caused the difference, not the colonizers. Okay? And you can see that's at the subnational level in places like India. Oops, almost fell down. So if we're looking at India, this is looking at female literacy. The highest female literacy is in Kerala, and then Nagaland, and then Goa, and then Mizoram. And you're like, wait a second. These are not the center of trade. These are not the center of British colonial activity. These are not the center of government activity. These are the centers of Protestantism and Catholicism in India. Okay, these people did not have a written language before the 1890s. They were hunter-gatherer people, and now they're almost all Baptists. And there's lots of Catholics and Protestants here, and there's lots of Catholics here. Okay, and they have the highest literacy rates in India, particularly of women's literacy. Now, if we look at infant mortality, we see the same pattern. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay? That is not because of what the Indian government did. That's not because of what the British government did. In fact, most of this place actually was indirectly ruled. And this was a Portuguese colony. And the British did almost nothing because it's just mountains and they didn't care. It's jungle. But it has this difference. Similar if we look at mass printing. We tend to think mass printing is something that like, oh, if I know how to print, that's a valuable technology, I will do that. But for hundreds of years, people knew how to print and didn't do it. Also, you had printing in East Asia way before you had it in Europe, and it didn't have the same effects. So Europeans did not invent printing. The Chinese had printing, and the Japanese and the Koreans about 800 years before Europe did. Europe did not invent movable font metal type. The Koreans did. They had movable font metal type about 80 years before Europe did. It did not have the same transformative effect that it had in Europe. However, it changed mostly who had books, not how many people had books. It did expand it some, but you never get the same explosion of mass publishing. You never got nationalism. You never got newspapers. You never got all these things until the 19th century. Now, tons of people had contact with China and Europe over hundreds of years and didn't print. So if we look at the Mongols invaded China. The ones who became Mahayana Buddhist printed. The ones who became Muslim didn't. You have the Uyghurs in Western China. They printed when they were a combination of Christian, Manichaean, and Buddhist. And then when they became Muslim, they stopped. And you had all this contact with Europe, etc. Over time. Nobody copied them, copied printing. I can go far more in detail, but I'm trying to be brief. Until you get Protestant missionaries coming along and printing tens of thousands of texts to try and convert people. And then all of a sudden the Muslims and the Hindus and the Theravada Buddhists start to print. Before that it was only Mahayana and Theravada Buddhists. Vajrayana Buddhists that printed, which are the type of Buddhism in China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Tibet, and Mongolia. Those are the people who printed. But missionaries transformed it into a mass technology around the world. Similar if we talk about nonviolent social movement organizations. We tend to think like if you have a social movement that you want to make, we think, oh, what do you do? Well, you form an association, and then you have directors of that association, and then you have a newsletter or a newspaper, and then you have traveling speakers, and then you march, and you have placards, and then you sign petitions, and you make boycotts, and you do all these things which we think are normal. Okay? Those are pioneered, for the most part, in the late 19th and early 20th century. And they are pioneered by a group of people, mostly nonconformist Protestants and evangelical Protestants in England and the United States. And they're the people who spread them around the world. They took these technologies that were originally developed for doing religious movements, and then they use them for political movements. So if you're a church that doesn't receive money from the state, you have to instill voluntarism, you need to instill charity, you need to have a way to sort of recruit people and get them excited about your faith, which they did. And then along came particular movements like slavery or abolitionism and temperance and other things like that, which they thought, oh, these are morally wrong. We need to change them. So they used these similar tactics that were used originally for religious purposes and used them for political purposes. Now, over time, it's become detached. So you don't have to need to learn these techniques from religious groups. You can learn them from any other political movement. But they originated in a particular place, and we can see that historically, not only in terms of who pioneers them in Europe and North America, but who spreads them around the world. So, for example, you get the solidification of these sort of tactics in the early 19th century in the United States, both in the Northeast and in the Western frontier and in England. But almost simultaneously, you get them emerging in Calcutta, India, and among the Xhosa in Southern Africa, who are using similar techniques because they're taught to them by the missionaries. Okay? And then that has political implications in terms of civil society, the ability of people to organize, to pressure for the things that they want. So if we look at a place like India, the early Baptist missionaries, William Carey, what's called the Serampore Trio, they went there, they printed the Bible into, I don't know, like 40-some languages within the first 20 so years, and printed tens of thousands of copies of this. And then they were trying to convert people, but they also saw some things that they thought that they didn't like. So there was a practice called sati, where when a man died, his wife was supposed to burn herself alive on his funeral pyre, which they thought was a bad thing. And so they organized protests against it in India, and they also organized protests in England, and they were trying to pressure the British East India Company to ban it. Now, the British East India Company didn't want to ban it because they're like, just stay out of politics, don't make waves, because if you make waves, then people will get upset and it will maybe lead to violence or whatever. They just want to make money, basically. But the missionaries were not easy to shut up, and so they kept protesting. Now, then that influenced other people. So there was a man named Ram Mohan Roy who originally helped the missionaries translate the Bible into Bengali. By that time, he had decided rather than becoming a Christian, he was going to reform Hinduism. And so he didn't want people to become Christian. He wanted them to be reformed Hindus, but he wanted to get rid of these embarrassing things like sati. And so he created Brahma Samaj to compete, to try and mobilize against sati, but using the same tactics. Other people wanted to defend sati and keep it, so they created Calcutta Dharma Sabha to protect sati and prevent it from being removed. But they're copying these same tactics. Now, originally the British East India Company and later the British colonial government had an awkward, somewhat uncomfortable relationship with missionaries. So as long as you were organizing against the missionaries, that was fine. But over time, these organizations become bigger and more powerful, and they have newspapers and they have cross-regional networks. And then over time, they start to pressure the colonial government first to expand more positions in the bureaucracy for Indians. And then they become increasingly anti-colonial, and they become the foundation for the political parties. Okay, so you have this flowering of organizational civil society, which leads to political parties, which forces the British to gradually give over power, which then meant you had more people who had experience running things before the British left, and it wasn't as much chaos when they left. I mean, on the positive side. On the negative side, it meant that the political parties were aligned along religious lines, because these organizations that were the foundation for them were religious organizations, which then accentuated the conflict between Muslims and Hindus at independence. You see, because the political organization was aligned religiously. So it had those both positive and negative effects. Limiting colonial abuses. Again, I'll be brief, because I don't want to go too long. But they were the major advocates of colonial reform movements, such as abolition. So the movement against slavery. Most missionaries, when they went out, were not abolitionists. But their experience of slavery radicalized them over time. And they became the main people who turned abolitionism into a mass movement, which had profound influences in terms of the freedom of labor. They also pioneered, they didn't create the term trusteeship, but they were the ones who popularized it. And after their success with the abolition of slavery, they created what was called the Select Committee on Aborigine Tribes, which became the Aborigines Protection Society, which did surveys of missionaries and others around the British Empire, seeing how indigenous people were treated and trying to reform British colonial policy based on that. Now, they had a lot of influence on the first part of the 19th century. Over time, their influence wanes as other people copy their tactics. So if you're the first people to organize, you have more power. Once other people start organizing using the same tactics, you'd have less power. Okay? That's what happens. And so over time, they have less influence on colonial policy. But in the 19th century, they made a lot of very important reforms in British colonialism. I'll skip through. Here's the statement of the Aborigines Protection Society: to investigate what measures ought to be adapted with respect to the native inhabitants of countries where British settlements are made, and to the neighboring tribes in order to secure them the due observation of justice and the protection of their rights, to promote the spread of civilization among them, and to lead them to the peaceful and voluntary reception of the Christian religion. So you can see right within the statement, the purpose statement of the Aborigines Protection Society is both this sort of civilizational thing and this conversionary thing, which is then tied with the idea of transferring rights. Now, we can talk about that being paternalistic, and there's a paternalistic aspect of it, but at the same time, they were able to moderate colonialism in a way that other people were not. These types of reforms didn't happen when you didn't have non-state missionaries who were involved in it. And so then, as I talked about before, it facilitated the spread of voluntary associations and civil society, which has the ability to sort of moderate political abuses, and newspapers and other things like that. So what's the evidence for it? So if we look here, we won't go into the statistics too much, but again, this is talking about where you have low corruption, this is where you have high rule of law, this is where you have higher government efficiency, and you can see that Protestant missions predicts all three of those outcomes. And the mechanism, I would argue, is through the spread of newspapers and civil society, and also through the reform of British colonial policy. Economic development. Again, I'll walk you through this. Here we're predicting economic development in 1870. So GDP per capita in 1870. These are current dollars. I changed the numbers are adjusted so you can figure out what they mean. This is too big if it was 19th century dollars. So we're first controlling for economic development in 1820. So mathematically, that's the equivalent of if we make every society have the same economic development per capita. Okay? Then if we add mission station after this date, we can see that for each mission station, on average, people made $246 more by 1870, which is a huge number. It should scare you a little bit. I mean, it scares me a little bit because it's so big. Okay? That's huge. Now, oops, sorry. Next, we're predicting economic development in 1913. But we're controlling for our previous dependent variable. So now we're equalizing all the countries, basically, mathematically, in terms of their economic development in 1870. And we're adding missionaries in 1881. And we see for each, oops, I hit the wrong button. So then we can see that for each mission station you're making $141 more per capita, which again is huge, although smaller. Okay? Now, if we add mission station in 1903, it's a smaller effect, but still a positive effect on economic development in 1913. Now, if missionaries were going to places that were already more economically developed, we would expect this to be bigger than this. Got it? But if missionaries are doing the causing, if they have more time, they're going to have a bigger effect than if they have less time. And that's what we see. This is bigger, this is smaller. Got it? Originally, Catholic missions is not doing the same type of thing. That starts to change in the 1920s and further on. So Catholic missions doesn't have a positive effect on economic development in 1913. However, if we take this dependent variable and we control for it here, again equalizing, and now we're looking at economic development later, 1950s and 1970s, we see that both Protestant and Catholic missionaries have a positive effect on economic development by the 1970s. Okay? Controlling for economic development in 1913. See? So you're again trying to equalize each step, and then you're showing when you add missionaries, there's this positive growth. So it's like if things are equal, and then I add a mission station here, and this one goes boop, and then I equalize again, and I add a mission station here, and it goes boop. It keeps on being the same places that are growing. So either they're amazingly prescient about which places are going to grow for other reasons, or they're having an effect on this outcome. Okay? Now, natural experiment. The British didn't want missionaries to work with Muslims, so they made two lines. This is the earlier line. The advantage of this line is it's straight. Okay? So nothing in nature is straight. Missionaries for a long time were not allowed to go north of that line. Okay? So that line cuts these ethnic groups in half. So if you collect data for the 10 kilometers north of that line and data for the 10 kilometers south of that line, we're just going to compare within an ethnic group and within an ethnic group and within an ethnic group. Okay, across this line that no longer exists. And lo and behold, we find major differences, significant differences in education on either side of that line, in health and health provision, in durable goods, in housing quality, in income, in wages, etc. All kinds of differences that happen right at that line, which no longer exists, comparing in the same country, in the same state, in that same ethnic group. Okay? So if missionaries didn't cause those differences, you have to find another thing that's moved there, change that line. Okay? Similarly, some other people who were following up on my work did work in China, and they said, well, missionaries went to do disaster relief when there was a flood or a drought. Okay? So a flood or a drought is not helping your economy, but having a flood or a drought is going to get you to have more missionaries. Okay? So what they did is they showed if you had a drought, before 1848, missionaries were not allowed in China. If you had a drought or a flood before that time, the first part of the 19th century, it has a negative effect on your economic development now. In 1949, the communists kicked out the missionaries. If you had a drought or flood after 1949, it has a negative effect on your economic development now. But during the late 19th and early 20th century, if you predict the number of missionaries based on droughts and floods, it has a positive effect on your economic development now. So unless you can think of a reason why droughts and floods would hurt you before the mid-19th century and after the mid-20th century, but help you during the late 19th and early 20th century, then you've demonstrated that missions has caused this effect. And it was a strong enough effect to survive through communism. okay? Which they did lots of stuff. Now, and then we can look at long-term development now. So look, this is Missionaries in 1923, and it's predicting economic development here. And you can see that for each missionary that you had in 1923, on average, you're making $655 more per capita. And it's explaining about 14% of the variation in economic development, which is scarily huge. Now, that's not proving that all that is causal. Some of it may be other things that are related to missions, and I control for lots of things. But you can at least see that there's this plausible relationship between missions and economic development. Same thing in terms of liberal democracy. Again, this is complicated, but we're predicting the average level of democracy between 1950 and 1994. This is a regression that includes lots of things that people have written about for a long time. So British colonies, having more Muslims, having more Europeans, not being a major oil producer, various things like that predict democracy. And all the things that are yellow predict democracy. Then we control for Protestant missions here. All of them matter. And all of these don't matter anymore, which is shocking because people have been writing about these for 40 years. And it's explaining 50.4% of the variation. Now, if we add Catholic missions here, it doesn't have a positive or a negative effect. It has a neutral effect. And if we drop everything that was not significant except for Dutch colonialism, which I'll explain why if you want me to, it's still explaining half the variation in democracy. So all these things that people have been writing about for 40 years are really explaining 0.4% of the variation in democracy. Not a lot. Okay, not a lot. So this effect is huge. Now, this got published in the American Political Science Review, which is the best journal in political science. The process of getting it there was amazingly difficult. You will not believe the crazy things I had to go through. But you know, this should startle you. It startled me certainly when I first found those results, and I spent a lot of time trying to make them go away, and they didn't go away. But what it's meaning is that these religious factors seem to be very, very important. It doesn't mean that they are frozen in time. Religious groups change. Now, lots of religious groups believe in mass education. Lots of religious groups believe in voluntary associations and other things like that. But having this earlier exposure to that type of thing seems to have had a long-term benefit for societies that had earlier and stronger exposure to Protestant missions. So, my argument generally is that Christianity has had profound influence on what we consider to be modernity. I'm using those in air quotes because I don't think there's one modernity that everyone is just headed to. What we have now, we tend to call it modernity. Religion had a lot to do with it. Not only that, but religious incentives were important. It wasn't just they were carriers of this, their beliefs mattered. So if you're talking about printing, for example, the belief that everyone had to have access to the Bible in their own language made mass printing a valuable thing. And then religious competition was crucial. Religious liberty matters because in context of competition, other religious groups copy these behavior, and then the religious distinction disappears over time because of competition, which then I would argue is good. The implications of this, some of them are theoretical. Lots of people, when they talk about development, they talk about, class structure, whatever classes are, and all these other types of things, and they say, culture, religion, beliefs, those don't matter. Those are soft. Everyone can change those things. But what I argue is that actually you have this like yin and yang. Culture shapes things like class structure, and class structure shapes things like religion. It's actually a mutual influence rather than all the direction going from quote-unquote hard things like class structure to beliefs. It also has political implications, and one of the biggest ones, I think, is that religious liberty matters. Even if you're not a religious person, even if you don't care particularly about the types of religious people who do mission work, religious liberty seems to help the poor and help spread power within a society through the process of religious competition and religious groups doing things which break up an elite monopoly in terms of controlling resources. And you can show that it has had a profound influence on the development of society, both economically and politically. So even if you don't care anything about religion, you should care about religious liberty, because religious liberty matters. Thank you.